Wicker Man is a weird, horny, surprisingly engaging movie that holds up even better today than it did in the 1970s. It is my favorite movie. This September marks both the release of a 4K edition of The Wicker Man and my fourth time purchasing a copy of The Wicker Man. To celebrate, here are 3 spoiler-free facts that will help you better appreciate the movie, whether this is your first viewing or 40th. Screenwriter Anthony Shaffer basically argued that The Wicker Man was elevated horror some 45 years before the phrase was coined. I've read plenty of articles in which Shaffer and director Robin Hardy argue that it's more of a mystery or detective story, or even a musical more than a horror movie. Shaffer in particular has said that The Wicker Man is only a horror movie because of its horrific ending, which is a total cop-out. It's like if I said, I'm only mortal because I die at the end of my life. Like, yeah. And here's Christopher Lee, who plays Lord Summerisle, likewise insisting that it's not a horror movie.
Well, I never called it a horror movie. Some journalists said it was the Citizen Kane of horror movies. And Anthony Shaffer, who wrote it, and Robin Hardy, who directed it, and I and the other people who were in it, we didn't think that was the right word to use.
Am I really going to argue with Christopher Lee about what is and isn't a horror movie? Shaffer, despite being a big fan of horror movies, had a low opinion of horror movies. He defined horror movies as Christopher Lee with those silly teeth in, rushing around through papier-mâché corridors chasing nubile ladies. You know, not the dignified Christopher Lee of his movie. What this actually points to is that the horror genre suffered from the same dismissive attitude in the 60s and 70s and earlier and later as it does now. This idea that horror is inherently cheap and low quality and low class, and that good horror needs a new subgenre term, elevated horror, to distinguish it from the rest of the muck. I talk more about this in my jump scares video if you're interested. Shaffer has said that there has to be more to the genre than that. I've always found that the great ones have to be about something. But the thing about horror, the thing that I love about the genre, is that it inherently taps into the deepest, weirdest parts of the human psyche, so that even cheap horror usually has something to say about the people who made it, or about the cultural context they're creating from. Like, if you don't think every Dracula movie has something to say about xenophobia and horniness, I don't know what to tell you. But the thing that really sells Shaffer's opinion as so contemporary is this statement. I really think we should be finding new names for these things, because horror implies second-rate bits of crap. I think Shaffer would have been delighted to hear about the rise of elevated horror or prestige horror, which is filling this exact role in the horror ecosystem. Although I would argue not for the better, because it's just reinforcing this idea that adjectiveless horror is second-rate, silly teeth crap, and that it's not about anything. Christopher Lee said that Lord Summerisle is his greatest role, and The Wicker Man one of the greatest British films ever made. And this wasn't just because he got to wear the second best skirt and knee-high sock combo in cinema after Clueless. No, he was actually instrumental in getting this movie made. Shaffer recalls that he and Christopher Lee met Peter Snell, the managing director of British Lion, and they decided they wanted to work together on a project. That was in the 60s, and it took years for things to come together. Shaffer and Hardy collaborated on the script in 1972 and showed it to Lee, who absolutely loved it. Lee urged Snell to take on the project, and largely credits him with it getting made. In fact, Lee, Snell, and Shaffer all believed in the project so much that none of them took a salary up front to make the film. But sadly, changing tastes and hands at British Lion meant that The Wicker Man never got a full, proper release. This is perhaps ironically because it was perceived as just a horror movie. Instead, it was chopped up, losing about 15 minutes of footage, including the Gently Johnny scene, which sets the bar for horny songs and musicals everywhere. This shortened version was released as a B-movie to the A-movie Don't Look Now, a horror movie best remembered for its relatively graphic depiction of cunnilingus. Even then, with this sad truncated version, Lee personally called all of the film critics he knew and asked them to see the movie as a favor. Their response was positive, but the damage to the film had been done. The majority of that cut footage disappeared until the 2010s, when Lee and others involved in the film took up intense efforts to find the missing footage. Not all of it was found, probably about 5 minutes is just gone. But the mostly complete version was released as the final cut and is a far superior version of the movie. The year the final cut was released, Christopher Lee said in his annual Christmas message that it was one of the greatest British films of all time. And even after big roles in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and lots of other huge movies, he still said Lord Summerisle was his best role. And speaking of Lord Summerisle, he was based on a real person. But not the Lord Summerisle thanked in the opening of the movie. After the British Lion logo, you get this still, thanking Lord Summerisle and his community. I don't know if the 4K version will preserve this detail. Not every digital version does. Director Robin Hardy has said that there is a specific incident in a specific village that did help inspire the movie. They stumbled upon a hobby horse chasing girls, saying that it was very unpleasant being a stranger in that town on that day. Hardy also said he was inspired by William Lever. As all you soap magnate heads out there know, this dude was one of the co-founders of the Lever Brothers, which would later combine with Margarine Uni to become Unilever, one of those companies you always see on graphs about how all products are basically owned by like 10 megacorps. Anyway, before Lever was doing any of that, he bought the Isle of Lewis and, like Lord Summerisle's grandfather, set about winning over the townspeople and terraforming the island. I couldn't find evidence of what Hardy describes as the experimental agronomist planting palm trees on the Isle. I did find evidence, on this architectural school blog, that Lever had a model farm community in Belgium-occupied Congo as part of a palm tree plantation to get cheap palm oil. So who's the Lord Summerisle that they thank in that opening card? Nobody! They lied to you. There is no Lord Summerisle or religious community that they were allowed to observe. Shaffer said, well, it's a trick. I think Peter Snell first thought of it to lend some outward reality to this implausible tale, but the intention was to say to people who are not putting too much attention on the film, look, this really happened, and it did the trick. One of the core concepts of The Wicker Man, which you can see throughout the movie if you look for it, is the idea that these are modern pagans. Shaffer says they took reasonable trouble to make it perfectly contemporary, that people could wear suits and didn't run around in old cowls or something, which I often find takes away from the horror of the situation. Having a card in the opening thanking a modern-day Lord Summerisle lent that feeling of immediacy to the horror. Now, does that same feeling extend to us as a modern audience watching this 50-year-old movie? I think that depends highly on your threshold for 70s era cinematic techniques. Like, I love this movie with all my heart, but even I struggle sometimes with the electric folk guitar riff that you get towards the end. Who am I kidding? I love it. But I find the way that everybody behaves to still feel very real and realistic in a way that makes it seem contemporary. I think the story still hits as though it were a modern movie, which is why nobody ever needs to or ever needed to remake The Wicker Man. Thank you for watching this video about The Wicker Man. It's my favorite movie, have I mentioned? And a special thank you to Alice, Common Opponent, and Courtney Danielle Welsh, who did actually let me sit in on one of their secret folk ritual rites, and it was far too nasty for me to make any content about. And if you're interested in watching 1 to 2 more essays about The Wicker Man, you can check out this video, Picking Sides in The Wicker Man, which I made last year. Or you can join my Patreon at patreon.com/thejenna, because I'm about to drop another video about The Wicker Man, specifically about a character in The Wicker Man that some film scholars believe is meant to be read as gay. And so the essay is about why and what that means for the lore of Summerisle if this one character is gay. So if you sign up at patreon.com/thejenna, you'll be able to watch that and all of the other videos that I've posted secretly that only Patreon subscribers get to watch. Enjoy!